My name is John Guest, and I'm CEO of the Houston Museum of African American Culture, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. This should be an exciting day for us, and so without further ado, let me bring our curator, who is responsible for our opening exhibition with Oda Binga Jones, and who thought to have this critical dialogue happen. Danielle Burns.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I'd just like to, as John just did, thank you for coming out on this raining day. I was saying that we all know what it's like. When the rain happens in Houston, people tend not to move around a lot, so thank you for coming out. I just want to do a brief introduction of all of our speakers today. First, we will have Franklin Sirmans. He's the chief curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Franklin, to name all of the exhibitions that he has curated or co-curated, or magazines that he's been editor of, it's numerous, but just wanted to let you know he is working on a show about Noah Purveying. And also just to let you know that Franklin also curated One Planet Under a Groove, and that was basically a show that changed my life. So I just always mention that. So anyway, next we have Joe Havel. He is the Glassell School and core director at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. Joe has been there for over 21 years. The core program started in 1982 and is a residency program that offers postgraduate residencies for art critics and visual artists. And then we have Jada Wright, who is the current creator and author of Heritage Salon. It's an online blog that talks about African American art and history. So if you could please welcome all of our speakers. And let us begin.
I guess we're all here to talk a little bit about challenges. And I think in some ways, I can't speak for everybody, but for myself, so I think we're all being challenged to some degree in what we do and what we're trying to do as far as being artists or being curators and critics. So I guess I'm just gonna talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been working on in the last year and a half. One exhibition and then some acquisitions, and then hopefully that leads to some questions that perhaps pertain a little bit more to our topic today. I'm trying to figure out where's the best place for me to stand. Okay. So I know some of you obviously from Houston, and had a very good time here working at the Manila Collection, and now live in Los Angeles and working at Los Angeles County Museum of Art is obviously a very different experience. I mean, I still get to work in a building that was done by Renzo Piano, but a totally different Renzo Piano. Not the young man that worked with the de Menils and probably was really shaped by the de Menils in terms of what he was going to do early in his career and his first building in this country. You can see in the background here is the Broad Contemporary Art Museum, and so that's a building that he did in 2008, and it's not quite, there's something that's odd about it, and installing in there, I've installed a few shows in there, and it just is not as flexible as, say, the Manila Collection building. I think there are certain flourishes that have been added to the structure of the way that he works, and perhaps that also has something to do with the person who commissioned this building, that person being Eli Broad, who probably had a much different idea of what he wanted to show the world of himself than perhaps the de Menils did in the 80s. So you can kind of make out, some of the forms are there that are similar. But I think the reason why I like this image is because, the Manila, I think, is very much about being grounded in terms of its local surroundings, Whereas what we're often trying to do at LACMA and being directly in the center of Los Angeles is we're being challenged to bring people into the museum. I mean, it's a paying museum. There is that difference. There is that challenge. It's not cheap. But one of the things that has been important in terms of it being sort of, at least architecturally and physically, a place to bring people is that we've been trying to create this idea of a plaza. And I think that idea goes back a little bit to this building. Around 2008, and since then, the whole experience of the Los Angeles County Museum has sort of shifted from a more eastern side, where you have buildings that are from this 1965 when the museum opened, and also from the mid-'80s. So different architecture, different times abutting against each other. And you now have this push on the western side that began with the Broad building. And I have another image where you'll see some of the other things that have been happening. But in the last 4 years, another gallery, another huge gallery space, one more like the sort of more simple structure of the Manil, was built, and that's called the Resnick Pavilion. So it's very much about a different kind of art experience, and it almost is a way of reflecting back on the 3-story building that you see there and wanting to do something that could be different, something that holds large-scale sculpture really, really well, as opposed to, I think, the way that the other building is broken up. But in the quest to bring people there, and I mentioned the Resnick building, we also now have a restaurant and a bar which are right across from those buildings, and have done a lot to create this idea of a plaza, of being a meeting place, a place for dialogue. Even if you're not going into the museum, people can come by for the bar. So there is this idea that we can be a sort of laboratory for ideas. One of this piece, though, the Chris Burden, which accompanied the opening of the building, it was very much about creating this idea of a beacon. I think when people think of Los Angeles, the closest thing you think of physically to any sort of landmark is perhaps the Hollywood sign, or there's like this abstract idea of the ocean being somewhere nearby. So we've been thinking about that a lot in terms of how do you situate this museum as the county museum in the center of Los Angeles and getting people in. Upstairs in that Broad building, this is probably the vision or the idea that most people think of when they think of contemporary art at LACMA. This idea, we have sort of, I think we're challenging this idea now, and I should mention that Eli Broad, who paid for the building, of course, is now opening his own museum directly across the street from the Museum of Contemporary Art in downtown Los Angeles. So the balloon dog and the cracked egg there, and I have a better image after that. Actually, you also saw Warhol Rorschach in there, so there was a little bit, some other things going on, but essentially it's an installation that centers on Koons with Andy Warhol and John Baldessari. On one hand, Warhol being the influential older artist and the iconic artist who shares some of the same, perhaps, ideas that come forth in Koons. And then on the other hand, thinking of Baldessari in the same way, but also wanting to recognize Los Angeles and Baldessari's influence as a teacher and as an artist who's been in LA for the last 50-something years. But I do believe that even with that being a full-on installation, I think what a lot of people come away with is the balloon dog and the cracked egg. Those two pieces we are now beginning to think about life after them, thank God. So they've been there ever since the building opened, and they'll be leaving next in March. And I already, people are some people are very upset, like board members even, who are like, no, you can't let that happen. I'm like, I don't really have a choice. But I think it is good for just the identity of the museum and the changing identity of the museum, and not being linked specifically to this one collector. And I think that's obviously one of the major challenges that we face as curators and people who work in museums nowadays is, where do the collections come from? There aren't exactly a lot of great collections that have been built, perhaps in the way that the Menil collection was built, at a time when you're collecting your peers, and then you have the wherewithal to go around that in a sort of eclectic way, and I think, to create something very special that you then want to provide to the public. I think everybody says that, but nowadays, like I think of say the Miami situation where you have many different collectors who are all building their own museums, and it's a different way of working. So you can go to the next image. Trying to think through that. One of the ways that I tried to encounter the collection was to think through, and I should say, as the head of contemporary, we talk about it in terms of 1968 to the present. So you have a modern art department that's dealing with the work before that, and then we're trying to think about, well, how do we look at the art of the past in the present? So one way that we did that was we did an exhibition called Human Nature, this show that really brought out a lot of the contemporary collection in that building, and it was on the whole second floor, so it was about 18,000 square feet. As a way of sort of defining what is the collection at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So we started off with this work by Bruce Nauman, and I think, unlike the Menil, where you have certain artists who have been collected in incredible depth, walk into the room of Rothko's or walk into a room of Ernst or Magritte. This collection, since 1965, has not been collected that way. It has been much more of an eclectic sort of way of collecting, and you think more about singular pieces than you do about artists. Nauman is one of the few where there actually are more than a few pieces. And so we were trying to build a collection or an idea of the collection with him in mind, and thinking about the fact that we had work from different decades, from 60s, 70s. This neon, and I have another slide, is this piece, Human Nature, from